Robert Koch was a scientist that figured out that specific microbes can cause specific diseases. Whereas Jenner was able to come up with a means to protect people from a specific disease like smallpox. He didn't know why it was protecting them. He just knew it did. But Cook came up with a means to determine that a specific organism causes a disease. And once you learn that, then you can try to start fighting that organism because you now know what the pathogen is. And so he came up with a set of 4 postulates that allow us to identify specific organisms. So the first postulate states that anytime an organism has a specific disease, the microorganism that causes the disease must be present. And so here we're looking at Bacillus anthracis. And if Bacillus anthracis actually causes the disease anthrax, then every animal that has anthrax should have Bacillus anthracis in their system. So you have to see the pathogen in the system. The second postulate is you have to be able to isolate that pathogen from the tissue of the sick organism and produce a pure culture. So a pure culture is a culture that only has one species in it. Typically, it's started by one individual cell, and that cell will then replicate, producing a colony of the same cells. From there, we can take that pure culture, and in the third postulate, we can infect a healthy animal with the disease-causing organism, and that animal should fall ill with the disease because now the disease is in that animal. The fourth postulate states that once that animal has the disease, we should be able to again pull out the disease-causing microbe, and it should be the same disease-causing microbe that was from the first animal. And we should be able to again produce a pure culture from this organism. So those are the 4 postulates that he came up with. But to do this, he had to be able to produce a pure culture. And when you are growing organisms in a broth, it's not always as easy to find pure cultures. So he had to develop mechanisms to produce a pure culture. And one of those, he came up with this idea. A woman by the name of Franny Hess would use agar to thicken the jams and jellies that she was producing. And between her and Cook, they came up with this idea that thickening agent, that agar, could also be used in broth. And if we use it in the broth that he was able to grow bacteria in, that would make a perfect solid agar that the bacteria could grow on, and he could then isolate individual species. So produce pure cultures on the agar. This is going to bring us to the different types of microbes. So we've talked about microbes in general, and talked about the fact that microbes can be beneficial to some extent. I didn't give you a lot of information about the benefits of microbes yet. We also talked about the fact that microbes can cause some very serious diseases. But what groups or where do microbes fall in? The term microbiology studies a lot of microbes. And the term microbe includes living and non-living organisms. So the living organisms that we study bacteria. That's the main organisms. Those are the main organisms we're going to focus on. We study mycology. So those are fungi, like mushrooms and yeasts. We study phycology. Phycology is algal species. Protozoology, that's protozoans. We also study parasitology, so the study of multicellular organisms. Um, so an example of a multicellular organism that we will study, even though, so it's very large, but we put it in this group because they are microscopic in their egg and their larval forms. And so we'll study worms, so helminthic worms. We will study, again, I've already talked about protozoans, but we'll also study insects in this group. Insects aren't microorganisms in a nutshell, but they do spread microorganisms. And so we study them here as well, a small amount, okay? We also will talk about viruses and some virus-like agents called viroids. Another thing that's not listed on here that we sometimes discuss are prions. Prions are infectious proteins, so proteinaceous particles that don't fold properly, and when they get into your system, they cause other proteins to not be able to function properly. And so they cause diseases like spongiform encephalopathies. So very severe diseases. Mad cow disease is the most, I think, well known of these diseases. Okay. So let's look at the groupings of these organisms. There are two cell groups that we look at. The first is called the prokaryotic cell group. Prokaryotic means lacking a membrane-bound nucleus. So pro means pre, karyote means nucleus. So pre-nucleus, basically. And there are two groups of organisms that fall under this category. They are the bacteria and the archaea. And then we have eukaryotes. Eukaryotic organisms. Eu means true. Again, karyote means nucleus. So these are the organisms that contain a membrane-bound nucleus. And so these are your plants, animals, fungi, and protists. And we will focus mainly on the fungi, the protists, and when we talk about the animals, we'll be looking at the helminthic organisms and your insects. So the first two groups, bacteria and archaea, which are your prokaryotes, are two very large groups of organisms that have millions of species in each. So we have bacteria that have millions of species. We have archaea that have millions of species. They're all prokaryotic. The most common shapes for these organisms are going to be coccus or rod-shaped, but some will be spiral-shaped, and some have unique forms. Prokaryotic organisms live pretty much everywhere on Earth. Bacteria specifically live everywhere that humans can live, and then some places where humans can't live. Archaea are your more extreme organisms. Viruses are non-living bags of nucleic acid, basically. They are either going to contain DNA or RNA, but they never contain both. The DNA or the RNA is surrounded by a protein coat. And viruses are non-living because they don't have a cell structure, and all living things have to have cell structure. Viruses can't replicate without taking over the host machinery. But when a virus does take over the host, it can cause very bad problems. Viruses cause some of the worst diseases on Earth, and they can infect all organisms. including bacteria. Let's look at the eukaryotic organisms. So here we are at the eukaryotes. Fungi are the first eukaryotic organisms that I'll mention. Fungi include mushrooms, molds, as well as yeasts. And some of these are really beneficial to us because they help to make the foods and the drinks that we enjoy: cheese, yogurt, wine, bread. But some are very detrimental because they can also cause molding of food, so they're food spoilage organisms. Some microbes or some fungi actually are really beneficial because they produce these things called antibiotics, and antibiotics can kill bacteria. So that's where this joke comes from. We're all out of penicillin, so just let this loaf of bread get nice and ripe and take 2 slices a day. Don't ever do that. It's a joke. But the idea here is it's fungi that produce penicillin. Protists are single-celled organisms. They are in a group called Protista. Algae are not typically put into this group anymore. So we'll study algal species on their own. But I do have algae right here. These are volvox. Volvox are single-celled algal species, but they can make multicellular organizations. But each of those little structures is its own cell, its own living organism within this larger community. And this over here, these are protozoans that cause disease. This is Trypanosoma brucei. Trypanosoma brucei causes a disease known as African sleeping sickness. And that disease is so detrimental that there are regions in Africa that people can't live because that disease is so prevalent in that area. Helminths are your large multicellular organisms. They're macroscopic, so you can see them without a microscope, but the eggs are microscopic, and the larval form that typically infects a human is microscopic. So these are tapeworm eggs, and this is a tapeworm. This is macroscopic, you can see it, but these you cannot see. These are so small that you could get tapeworm eggs in your mouth easily and you wouldn't even know it. I'm going to stop this video and then we'll talk about the second golden age of microbiology in our next video. Actually, in our last video, I should say. So you have a wonderful break, and I'll see you in a few.